The last shovel of dirt made a sound like a sigh. Eliza Hart stood back, her hands raw and her knuckles bleeding inside Jonah's worn leather gloves. The mound was pitifully small against the vast, indifferent expanse of the Arizona Territory. It was a scar on the land that the wind would erase by week's end, taking the last physical trace of her husband with it. There was no stone to mark the place, no wood for a cross, just packed earth, a silent testament to a life ended by fever and a journey that had demanded too much. The wagon train was long gone. She could still see the faint dust of their passing on the horizon, a smudge of betrayal against a mercilessly blue sky. They had been kind at first, offering condolences, and then, as Jonah's fever climbed, offering distance. Dr. Evans had used the word contagion, and the word had spread faster than the sickness itself. Fear was a powerful whip. It had driven them on, leaving her with a wagon, 2 exhausted mules, and a body to bury. They had left her some water, a bag of cornmeal, and their apologies. The apologies felt as empty as the water canteen now felt light in her hand. She sank to her knees, the coarse fabric of her dress scraping against gravel. The heat was a physical weight, pressing down on her head and shoulders, stealing the moisture from her eyes before a tear could properly form. She had wept already, back in the suffocating stillness of the wagon when Jonah's breathing had ceased. Now, there was nothing left but a hollow ache and the burning in her throat. Thirst. It was a living thing, a predator stalking the edges of her grief. She reached for the canteen at her hip, unscrewed the cap, and tipped it to her lips. She allowed herself only a single, agonizingly small swallow. The water was warm, tasting of metal and desperation. It did little to quench the fire inside her, but served as a stark reminder of her reality. She had maybe a day's worth of water left if she was careful. A day to do what the mules, tethered to the wagon, stood with their heads hung low, their resilience already surrendered to the sun. The wagon itself, a vessel of doomed hope, was a monument to a life she no longer had. Inside the wagon, beside her own small satchel, was Jonah's, a simple canvas bag holding his shaving kit, a spare shirt, and his leather-bound journal. He was always writing in it, sketching maps of places he'd never been and making notes she could not decipher. He had clutched it even as the fever stole his senses. She had placed it in his bag herself, a final act of wifely duty. It was all she had left of him, those few possessions and the shallow grave under the sun. A lizard skittered over a rock nearby, its movements quick and efficient. It knew this world. It understood the rules of sun and shade, of thirst and survival. Eliza felt like a ghost, a pale, clumsy creature completely out of place, already fading into the landscape. She pressed a hand to her stomach, feeling a knot of fear so tight it threatened to choke her. She was 32 years old, a widow in the middle of nowhere, with no skills suited to this land of rock and thorn. Back east, she could sew a fine seam, play the parlor piano, and manage a household. Here, those skills were as useless as a silk dress in a sandstorm. She tried to think, to make a plan. Stay with the wagon. It offered shade, but it was a stationary target for whatever might be watching from the shimmering waves of heat. Try to walk, but where the trail was a faint pair of ruts in the dirt, leading into an eternity of bleached-out landscape. She had no real map, only a vague notion that a settlement called Silver Creek lay some 50 miles east. 50 miles might as well have been the moon. The sun began its slow descent, painting the western sky in brutal strokes of orange and purple. The heat did not lessen. It only changed character, becoming a thick, suffocating blanket, as shadows stretched like long, skeletal fingers across the desert floor. A new fear emerged, colder and sharper than her thirst. The fear of the night. The stories she had heard at campfires. Tales of predators, both animal and human, whispered back to her on the hot, dry wind. She forced herself to move, her limbs stiff and protesting. She would build a fire A fire meant warmth against the coming chill, a light against the darkness. It was an act of defiance. She gathered scrub and dry branches, her hands clumsy, her mind a fog of grief and anxiety. As she worked, she heard a sound, a soft crunch of gravel. Not the wind, not an animal. Eliza froze, her heart hammering against her ribs. She straightened slowly, her hand reaching for the heavy iron skillet she had left by the wagon wheel. She turned, her knuckles white around the handle. He stood 20 yards away, as still and silent as the saguaro cactus behind him. He had appeared from nowhere, as if the desert itself had conjured him from dust and shadow. He was Apache. She knew it instantly from the beaded moccasins, the simple breechcloth, and the leather band holding back his long, black hair. His skin was the color of the red earth, his face a mask of high cheekbones and a strong jaw. He held a rifle loosely in one hand, its barrel pointed toward the ground. His eyes, dark and unreadable, were fixed on her. Every story she had ever been told, every prejudice she had ever absorbed, screamed at her to run, to scream, to fight. The word savage echoed in her mind, a venomous whisper from a world that seemed a lifetime away. But her body was paralyzed by a fear so profound it left no room for action. Her feet felt rooted to the baked earth. He did not move closer. He simply watched her, his expression unchanging. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. It was broken only by the frantic pounding of her own blood in her ears. She watched his chest rise and fall in a slow, steady rhythm. He was not agitated. He was not aggressive. He was simply present. Slowly, deliberately, he raised his free hand, palm open, in a gesture that was universally understood. It was not a threat. He took a single step forward and stopped again. He seemed to be giving her time, allowing her to absorb his presence, to conquer the initial wave of her terror. "You need water," he said. His voice startled her more than his appearance. It was low and calm, the English words spoken with a slight accent but with perfect clarity. It was not the guttural snarl of a barbarian she might have imagined. It was the voice of a man. She could not find her own voice to answer. She only stared, clutching the skillet like a shield. He seemed to understand her fear. He unslung a canteen from his shoulder, a motion so fluid and natural it was like watching water flow. He took a few steps closer, then stopped, leaving a safe distance between them. He set the canteen on the ground and slid it gently across the dirt toward her. It stopped a few feet from her worn boots. "Drink," he said. The word was not a command, but a simple, factual statement, an observation of a need. Thirst was a more powerful master than fear. Her throat was a desert in itself. She hesitated for only a moment longer, her eyes darting from his impassive face to the canteen. She knelt, never taking her eyes off him, and snatched it up. The water sloshed inside, a sound more beautiful than any music she had ever heard. Her hands trembled as she opened it and brought it to her lips. The water was cool, drawn from some deep, hidden spring. It was life. She drank deeply, greedily, until her senses began to return from the brink. When she finally lowered the canteen, gasping, she felt a profound sense of shame at her desperation. She looked at him, the man who had just saved her, and saw him not as a caricature from a story, but as a human being who had shown her mercy. He nodded slightly, as if to say, "I told you so." "My husband," she said, her voice a raw croak. She gestured vaguely toward the mound of earth. "The fever." "I saw the grave," he replied. "The wagon train left you." Another statement of fact. He was a man who dealt in what was not what should have been. "They were afraid," she whispered, feeling a need to defend them, though she felt little but bitterness toward them now. He did not respond to that. Fear was a reason, not an excuse. He looked at her small pile of kindling, then back at her. "You will not survive here alone. The night brings cougars. The day brings the sun. Both will kill you." She knew he was right. The knowledge sat in her stomach like a cold stone. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice gaining a little strength. Nothing in this world was free, least of all kindness from a stranger. His gaze was direct, meeting hers without flinching. "I will guide you, take you east, to the mountains. There is water there, game, a trail that leads to settlements." Eliza's heart gave a hopeful leap, immediately followed by a wave of suspicion. Why would you help me?" "I am not helping you for nothing," he said, his honesty as stark as the landscape. "I will provide protection. I will hunt. I will lead you on a safe path. In return, you will keep the camp. You will tend the fire. You will cook what I bring." He paused, his dark eyes weighing her. Safe passage in exchange for a warm fire and a cooked meal. It is a fair trade. She stared at him, trying to understand. An arrangement, a contract of sorts. He was not offering charity. He was proposing a partnership born of necessity. His terms were simple, practical. He needed a camp keeper, and she needed a protector. Fire for safety. It was a primitive bargain, stripped of all the complex courtesies and deceits of her world. There was a strange dignity in its simplicity. But the fear was still there, a coiled snake in the pit of her stomach. To go with this man, to place her life entirely in his hands, was to step off the edge of the world she knew. He was an Apache warrior. Her people and his were not at peace. To trust him went against everything she had been taught, everything she had been warned about. Yet, what was the alternative? To stay here and wait for death by thirst or by a predator's claws, to die alone beside the unmarked grave of her husband. Her survival instinct, a raw and powerful force she was only just beginning to understand, fought a desperate battle against a lifetime of ingrained prejudice. She looked at him again, really looked at him. She saw the weariness in the lines around his eyes. She saw the lean strength in his frame, a body honed by this harsh land. He was not a monster. He was a survivor, just like she was trying to be. He carried himself with a quiet confidence, a stillness that spoke not of aggression, but of a deep and certain knowledge of this world that she so desperately lacked. He had offered her water when she was dying. He was now offering her a path. Her gaze fell upon the grave again. Jonah was gone. The life they had planned together was gone. She was no longer Jonah Hart's wife. She was Eliza, a woman alone in the desert, and Eliza wanted to live. She took a deep breath, the hot, dry air searing her lungs. The decision, when it came, felt less like a choice and more like an acceptance of the inevitable. "I agree," she said, her voice clear and steady. "Safety for fire." The man gave a single, brief nod. There was no smile, no visible sign of triumph. It was a simple acknowledgement of their pact. "My name is Eliza Hart," she said, feeling a sudden need to establish herself as more than just a helpless woman. He looked at her for a long moment before answering, "I am Taza." He turned then and gestured for her to follow. He moved with an easy, silent grace, his moccasins making almost no sound on the rocky ground. Eliza stood for a moment, looking from the grave to the wagon, the last relics of her old life. Then, with a final, lingering look at the resting place of her husband, she picked up her satchel, slung the precious canteen over her shoulder, and walked away from it all, following the stranger named Taza into the deepening twilight. The journey was a blur of aching muscles and searing sunlight. Taza moved with an economy of motion that Eliza could only envy. He seemed to glide over the treacherous ground, his eyes constantly scanning, reading the subtle language of the earth. He pointed out the curve of a rock formation, the shadow that meant a slight drop, the particular shade of green that signaled a plant with thorns as sharp as needles. Eliza stumbled behind him, her city boots clumsy and loud on the gravel. She was a student in a harsh school, and her teacher was a man of few words and infinite patience. He led her away from the faint trail, into a landscape that seemed utterly impassable. They squeezed through narrow gaps in sun-baked rock and climbed inclines of loose shale that slid and shifted under her feet. More than once, His strong hands shot out to steady her, his grip firm and impersonal. He did not speak on these occasions, but his touch conveyed a simple message: I will not let you fall. Her initial terror had subsided, replaced by a profound and weary exhaustion. She put one foot in front of the other, focusing only on the back of the man in front of her, trusting that he knew a way through this desolate maze. Just as she felt she could not take another step, that her legs would simply fold beneath her. He stopped. They stood at the edge of a sheer drop, looking down into a narrow canyon she had not seen until they were upon it. It was a deep wound in the earth, hidden from view. Down below, she could see a darker line of green, a cluster of cottonwood trees clinging to life. It was an oasis of impossible beauty in a world of brown and gray. The descent into the canyon was even more difficult than the journey across the flats. Taza showed her where to place her hands and feet, guiding her down a path that was little more than a series of weathered notches in the rock face. When they finally reached the sandy floor, the air was noticeably cooler. The high rock walls on either side blocked the harshest of the sun, creating a sanctuary of shade and silence. A small spring bubbled up from a fissure in the rock, feeding a clear, shallow pool before disappearing back into the sand. The sound of the trickling water was the most beautiful symphony Eliza had ever heard. She knelt by the pool and drank, not with the frantic desperation of before, but with a slow, deep reverence. This water was a gift, a miracle. Taza drank as well, then set about making their camp in a shallow alcove, a natural hollow in the canyon wall that offered shelter and concealment. Over the next 2 days, the canyon became their entire world. Taza began her education in earnest. He did not lecture or explain in long sentences. He taught by doing. He would walk to a spot where the sand was damp and point to a flurry of tiny tracks. Birds, he said, they know where the water is closest to the surface, where they drink. You can drink. He showed her how to dig, not with her hands, but with a flat, sharp-edged stone, until she reached the cool, life-giving moisture. He found a plant with a thick, gnarled root. With his knife, he peeled back the tough outer layer to reveal a pale, starchy interior. He cut a piece and handed it to her. It was bland but filling, and it eased the gnawing emptiness in her stomach. He pointed out another plant, its leaves a vibrant green. This one looks good to eat, he said, his dark eyes watching her. But the juice will burn your mouth and twist your stomach. Some things are not what they seem. It was a lesson in survival, but Eliza felt it was a lesson about much more than that. She held up her end of their bargain. She gathered the dry, fallen branches from the cottonwoods. She learned to build a fire that gave off more heat than smoke. Taza brought back 2 rabbits one evening, and she cooked them over the flames, the smell of the roasting meat making her dizzy with hunger. They ate in silence, the quiet companionship a strange and unexpected comfort. In these quiet moments, she watched him. She learned things he did not explicitly teach. At sunrise and again at sunset, he would stand at the mouth of their alcove and face the east, murmuring quiet words she could not understand. Then he would turn to the south, the west, and the north, repeating his quiet prayer to the 4 directions. It was a ritual of deep reverence, a private communion with the world that had shaped him. She saw in it not the paganism she had been taught to expect, but a profound and humbling faith. One afternoon, while she was mending a tear in her dress, she saw him take a small, beaded pouch from around his neck. He opened it and tipped the contents into his palm. She saw a single, iridescent blue feather from a jay and a small, perfectly smooth white stone, polished by a river that had long since vanished. He looked at them not as objects, but as containers of memory, his expression softening in a way she had not seen before. She knew, with a certainty that needed no words, that they had belonged to his wife. She felt a pang of connection, a shared understanding of loss that transcended the vast cultural gulf between them. He, too, was a keeper of relics. He, too, was haunted by a ghost. On their third evening in the canyon, as the fire crackled and threw dancing shadows against the rock walls, the incident happened. Eliza was organizing her small satchel, making sure her few possessions were in order. Beside it lay Jonah's canvas bag. As she reached for her sewing kit, her elbow bumped the bag, and the leather-bound journal she had packed away tumbled out, landing in the dirt at the edge of the firelight. She reached for it quickly, a flush of embarrassment warming her cheeks. But as she did, she saw Taza go completely still. He was not looking at her. His gaze was fixed on the book. The flickering light had caught a faint, embossed marking on the leather cover, a symbol she had never paid much attention to. It was an eagle with its wings spread, perched atop a shield, a United States Army insignia. His reaction was not dramatic, but it was unmistakable. His shoulders tensed. A flicker of something cold and hard passed through his eyes, like a cloud passing over the sun. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He recognized the symbol, and it meant something to him, something dangerous. The easy silence that had grown between them was suddenly gone, replaced by a new, unspoken tension. He said nothing. He simply looked from the journal back to her face, his expression now unreadable. Guarded. Eliza felt a chill crawl up her spine that had nothing to do with the evening air. She quickly picked up the journal and shoved it deep into Jonah's bag, hiding it from his sight. Though she knew it was too late, the damage was done. A seed of mistrust had been planted in their fragile sanctuary. Later that night, sleep would not come. Eliza lay wrapped in her thin blanket, staring up at a sky littered with stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch. The fire had burned down to glowing embers. She replayed the moment in her mind. Taza's sudden stillness, the ice in his eyes. What did the insignia mean to him? Jonah had been a civilian contractor, a clerk who handled supply manifests for the army posts. He had never been a soldier. The journal was just a journal, filled with his thoughts and sketches. Wasn't it? A sound pulled her from her troubled thoughts. It was Taza, moving silently to the mouth of the alcove. He stood there, a silhouette against the starlight, listening. He had heard something her own ears, dulled by a lifetime of city noise, had missed completely. He motioned to her with a sharp, downward gesture. Stay down, be silent. Then she heard it, too, a faint, rhythmic clinking and scraping, carried on the night breeze. It was the sound of shod horses picking their way over rocky ground. There were riders near the canyon entrance. Taza faded back into the deepest shadows of the alcove, pulling her with him. He put a finger to his lips, his eyes boring into hers with a silent, urgent command. He pointed to the fire, and she understood. She carefully, silently, scooped sand onto the embers, extinguishing the last of their betraying glow. The canyon was plunged into near total darkness. The riders were closer now. Their voices drifted down to them, clear and sharp in the still air. He said she came this way, a gruff voice complained. I don't see nothing. No tracks, no dead mules, nothing. Another voice, colder and flatter. Cut him off. You get paid to look, not to see. Pike wants the book. He does not care if your feet get sore. The name Pike sent another jolt of alarm through Eliza. Captain Edmund Pike. He had been Jonah's commanding officer at Fort Defiance, a handsome, charming man who had always made her feel uneasy. What's so important about some dead man's diary, anyway? Silas, the first voice whined. The man called Silas did not answer immediately. When he did, his voice was laced with a chilling lack of emotion. It is not a diary, and it is not your concern. Your concern is the $20 you get when I have it in my hand. Now spread out. Look for any sign of a campfire. She is a city woman. She cannot survive without a fire. Eliza's blood ran cold. They were looking for her, for a woman with a book. They knew. But how and why? She clutched the canvas bag to her chest, the journal inside suddenly feeling heavy and toxic. a lead weight that was dragging her down into a world of trouble she could not begin to comprehend. She looked at Taza. In the faint starlight, she could see the grim set of his jaw. He was putting the pieces together, the army insignia on the book, the name Pike, the hunters in the night. His earlier suspicion had now hardened into a dangerous certainty. He understood what she did not, that Jonah's journal was no simple diary. It was something men were willing to kill for. He looked at her, then glanced toward the dark, narrow passage that led out of the far side of the canyon. He knew they could not stay here. These men were trackers. Come morning, they would find this place. They would find her. His mind was working quickly. He remembered the words of his grandmother, Nantan. Her voice as clear in his memory as the spring water. A promise is a stone you build your house on. You do not move it. He had made a bargain with this woman. He had promised her safe passage. That promise was now being tested by men with rifles and cold hearts. He leaned close, his breath warm against her ear. "Stay here," he whispered, his voice barely a sound. "Do not move. Do not make a sound until the first ray of sun touches that high peak." He pointed to a jagged finger of rock high above them on the canyon rim. She wanted to protest, to ask 1,000 questions, but the absolute authority in his voice stopped her. She saw the resolve in his eyes. He was not asking her. He was telling her. She gave a single, terrified nod. Without another word, he slipped away. He did not make a sound. One moment he was there, a solid presence in the darkness beside her, and the next he was gone, swallowed by the shadows. Eliza was utterly alone, huddled in the cold dirt, listening to the voices of the men who were hunting her. Her small world had been shattered. She was no longer a widow grieving in the desert. She was the prey, and her only protector had just vanished into the night. Miles away, a single stone skittered down a rock face, a small sound in the immense silence. Silas Crowley and his men heard it. They turned their horses, their attention drawn away from the hidden canyon, following the false trail that Taza was now carefully, deliberately, laying for them in the darkness. The longest night of Eliza Hart's life ended with a sliver of gray light on the eastern horizon. She had not slept, had barely breathed, huddled in the cold alcove while the hunters' voices echoed and faded. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of a leaf, sent a fresh wave of terror through her. She was a mouse in a shoebox, waiting for the lid to be lifted. Just as the first pale ray of sunlight touched the high, jagged peak he had pointed to, he was there. He did not emerge from the shadows. He simply materialized beside her, as silent as the dawn itself. There were no new scratches on him, no sign of a struggle, but a new intensity burned in his eyes. He carried her canteen, refilled from the spring. He handed it to her. "Drink," he whispered. It was a command. "We go now." There was no time for questions. He led her not to the main entrance of the canyon, but to the narrow passage at the far end. It was a tight squeeze, the rock walls scraping at her clothes and her satchel. When they emerged, they were in a different world, a wide, open plain dotted with skeletal ocotillo and prickly pear cactus. 2 horses stood waiting, tethered to a gnarled mesquite tree. One was a sturdy paint, the other a smaller, leaner bay mare. "Where did they come from?" she asked. Her voice hushed. "They were waiting," was all he said. He threw her small satchel and Jonah's bag over the mare's back, securing them with a leather thong. He then looked at her expectantly. Eliza stared at the horse. She had ridden in carriages, and once, as a girl, had been led around a paddock on a gentle pony. She had never truly ridden. "I do not know how," she admitted, the words tasting of shame. Taza's expression did not change. He gestured to the saddle. "The horse knows. Your job is to listen to it." He cupped his hands. "Put your foot here." The first hour was a misery of jarring bounces and a desperate, clinging fear. She gripped the saddle horn so tightly her knuckles were white, her body rigid against the mare's every movement. Taza rode ahead on the paint, his posture relaxed and fluid, a part of his horse in a way she could not comprehend. He did not look back, but she knew he was aware of her every clumsy struggle. After a time, he slowed his horse to a walk and drew up beside her. "You are fighting her," he said, his voice even. "You are two things, you and the horse. You must be one. Feel the way she moves. Let your body move with her." He reached over, his hand briefly touching the small of her back. "Breathe. Let your hips be loose. You are not a sack of flour." His touch was instructive, not intimate, but it sent a strange warmth through her. She consciously tried to relax her death grip, to let her body sway with the rhythm of the mare's walk. It was a small change, but the ride immediately became smoother, more bearable. They rode through a landscape that shifted and changed with the slow passage of the sun. The hills of cactus gave way to a wide, dry wash, the bed of a river that had run with water 1,000 years ago. The sun beat down on the bleached white stones, and the heat was a physical blow. Eliza felt a blister forming on her heel, a raw, rubbing pain inside her impractical boot. She said nothing, determined not to complain, not to be a burden. By midday, they reached a ridge of stunted, black-trunked pine trees. The shade was a blessing, and the air smelled of resin and dust. Taza dismounted in a single, effortless motion. "We will rest here," he said. Eliza practically fell from the saddle, her legs weak and trembling. She sat heavily on the ground, leaning against a rock, overwhelmed by a weariness that went bone deep. Taza tended to the horses first, loosening their cinches and allowing them to graze on the sparse patches of dry grass. Only then did he turn his attention to her. His eyes fell to her feet. "Your boot," he said. She looked down and saw a small, dark stain of blood on the worn leather. The blister had broken. Before she could protest, he was kneeling in front of her. He took her foot in his hand and, with a gentleness that surprised her, worked the boot off. The sight of the raw, angry skin on her heel made her wince. He laid her foot on his knee and examined it without a word. Then he rose and walked into the trees, returning a moment later with a handful of broad, green leaves. He crushed them between two stones until they formed a dark, moist pulp. He carefully applied the poultice to her blister. The effect was immediate, a cool, soothing relief that eased the fire of the wound. "It will draw out the hurt," he said, wrapping her foot in a clean strip of cloth from his own pack. "Your shoes are not made for this land." As he worked, she noticed the saddle on her mare. The leather was old and cracked in places, and one of the stirrup straps had been crudely mended with twine. It was a small detail, but it spoke of a life of making do, of patching things together to keep moving forward. Later, while she rested, he took the saddle from the mare. He produced an awl and a leather thong from his pack and set about repairing the broken strap. He did not rush. His hands moved with a quiet, practiced skill, his stitches small and even. He was not just fixing a piece of equipment. He was restoring it. He was making it strong, reliable. She watched him, mesmerized by the focused intensity of his work. It was another lesson, another quiet act of care. He was literally mending the foundation of her support, ensuring she could continue the journey. This man, this stranger, was holding her up, both figuratively and literally. He taught her about the rifle next. It was a heavy Winchester, well cared for, its wooden stock smooth with use. He did not let her hold it at first. He showed her how to check that it was empty. He made her practice the motions of loading and unloading, again and again, until her fingers, clumsy at first, began to find a rhythm. "A gun is not a club," he said, his voice low and serious. "It is not for anger. It is a tool. You only point it at what you mean to kill, nothing else, ever." He set up a piece of dried cholla cactus on a rock 50 paces away. "Breathe out. Squeeze the trigger slowly. Do not pull it." The first shot deafened her, and the recoil slammed the rifle butt hard against her shoulder, making her yelp. The bullet kicked up dust a full 10 feet to the left of the target. Her shoulder throbbed with a blooming ache. Taza took the rifle from her without comment. He adjusted her stance, moving her shoulder so it was pressed more firmly against the stock. "Become part of the rifle," he said. "Let it become part of you. Do not be afraid of it. Respect it." She tried again. She breathed. She squeezed. The shot was still wide, but closer. Her third shot chipped a piece from the rock near the cactus. A small thrill, a tiny flicker of competence, went through her. It was a feeling she had not experienced in a long time. They were preparing to move on when they heard it. The splintering crack of wood, followed by a man's frustrated curse in Spanish. Taza was on his feet in an instant, his body alert, his hand resting on the stock of his own rifle. He motioned for her to stay put and moved silently to the edge of the ridge, peering down into the wash below. After a long moment, he beckoned her forward. Down in the dry riverbed was a wagon. One wheel canted at a sickening angle. A man, a woman, and 2 small children stood beside it, their faces etched with despair. One of the wagon's axles had snapped clean through. They were stranded, just as she had been. Taza started down the slope, and after a moment's hesitation, Eliza followed. The man saw them coming and immediately pushed his wife and children behind him, his hand going to a large pistol tucked into his belt. His face was a mask of fear and suspicion. "We mean you no harm," Taza said, his voice calm, holding his hands up, palms open. "We saw you had trouble." The man, whose name was Mateo Dominguez, did not relax. His dark eyes darted from Taza's Apache features to Eliza's pale, sunburnt face. The combination was confusing, unnatural, but his wife, Maria, looked past Taza and saw only Eliza. She saw the exhaustion in her eyes, the torn dress, the weary set of her shoulders. She saw another woman facing the vast indifference of this land. Maria stepped out from behind her husband. "Our axle," she said, her English soft and accented. "It is broken." The tension eased, replaced by the universal language of shared misfortune. While Mateo explained how the wheel had hit a hidden boulder, Maria offered Eliza a sip of water from their barrel. It was a simple gesture of solidarity, a recognition of their common struggle. Taza examined the broken axle. He looked at the tools Mateo had, then at the surrounding landscape. He pointed to a sturdy, iron-hard mesquite tree a short distance away. He and Mateo spent the next 2 hours working, using a small hand axe to cut a thick, straight branch. Taza showed him how to trim it, how to notch it so it would brace the broken axle. He worked with a quiet competence, his knowledge practical and profound. As the men worked, Eliza sat with Maria and the children in the shade of the wagon. The little girl, no more than 5 years old, offered Eliza a small, flat cake made of cornmeal. Eliza accepted it with a grateful smile, her heart aching with a strange mix of sorrow and warmth. When the repair was finished, the wagon listed to one side, but it was solid. It would hold until they reached the next town. Mateo Dominguez was overcome with gratitude. He tried to offer Taza money, but Taza simply shook his head. "You would have done the same," he said. "Perhaps," Mateo said, his eyes filled with a new respect, "but not many would have stopped. Not for us." He looked from Taza to Eliza again, his curiosity finally overriding his caution. He did not ask the question that was clearly on his mind, but it hung in the air between them. Instead, he reached into the wagon and pulled out a rolled-up piece of hide. He unrolled it to reveal a hand-drawn map. "We are coming from the west," he said. "This is a shortcut, an old miner's trail through the Dragoon Mountains. It will save you 2 days of riding and avoid the army patrols on the main route." He pressed the map into Taza's hands. "Please, it is all I have to offer." Taza studied the map for a long moment, then nodded. "We thank you." They parted ways. The Dominguez family heading slowly east in their hobbled wagon, their waves and shouted thanks echoing in the hot, still air. As she and Taza rode on, a new kind of silence settled between them. The encounter had changed something. They were no longer just two individuals bound by a contract. They were partners who had, together, performed an act of kindness. That evening, as they made camp, Eliza felt a boldness she had not possessed before. The questions that had been swirling in her mind for days finally found a voice. "You had a wife," she said. It was not a question, but a statement. She looked at the small beaded pouch he always wore. Taza was silent for a long time, staring into the flames of their small fire. The light flickered across the stark planes of his face, making the shadows deep and mysterious. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, heavy with a grief that had been worn smooth by time, but was no less sharp. Her name was Sansi. He said, the name a soft breath of air. It means morning star. He looked up from the fire, his gaze distant, seeing a past she could only imagine. She was not of this land. Her people lived by the great river to the east. I brought her here after the soldiers burned her village. He paused, his hand unconsciously going to the pouch at his neck. She was strong. Her heart was good. But she did not know the sicknesses that travel with the white man. A cough came to our camp. It came with the blue coats and their treaty papers. It spread like a fire in dry grass. Many died. The very young, the very old. His voice broke, just for an instant. And Sansi, he fell silent again. The story told, it was a story of a great love and a great loss, a personal tragedy intertwined with the larger tragedy of his people. Eliza felt a profound ache in her chest, an empathy that was sharp and painful, and with it came a wave of guilt so powerful it almost stole her breath. She thought of the stories she had grown up with, the casual way people in her world spoke of the Apache, the assumptions they made, the cruelty they excused. She had believed those stories, or, at least, she had never questioned them. She had lived her life wrapped in a blanket of comfortable prejudice. Now, sitting across a fire from this man, this grieving husband whose people had been decimated by a sickness her own people had brought, she felt the full, crushing weight of her own ignorance. The savage was not him. The savagery was in the blindness that had allowed her to see him as anything less than a man. "I am sorry," she said, the words feeling small and utterly inadequate. Taza looked at her, his eyes holding hers across the fire. He seemed to see the genuine remorse in her face, the shift that had occurred within her. He gave a slow, somber nod, accepting her apology not as a solution, but as a beginning. The wall of prejudice that had separated them had finally, irrevocably, crumbled. The space between them was no longer an empty void of fear and suspicion. It was now filled with a shared, fragile humanity. They were no longer just a guide and his charge. They were two people, bound by loss and hunted by a common enemy, finding their way through the wilderness together. The town appeared suddenly, a collection of tired, unpainted wooden buildings huddled in a dip in the terrain as if seeking shelter from the vast, open sky. To Eliza, after weeks in the wilderness, it looked like the very heart of civilization. Smoke curled from a blacksmith's forge. The sound of a hammer on an anvil rang out like a steady heartbeat, and the distant, tinny music of a piano drifted from a saloon. It was a place of people, of walls and roofs, a place where you could buy salt. The thought was so simple, so mundane, it was almost overwhelming. They stopped on a low rise overlooking the settlement. Taza dismounted, his eyes scanning the layout of the streets, the location of the livery, the fort that stood on a bluff to the south, a flag hanging limp in the heat. "I will wait here," he said, his voice a low murmur. "It is not a good place for me." Eliza understood. A lone Apache warrior riding into a frontier town was an invitation for trouble. Her, on the other hand, a lone white woman, would merely be an object of curiosity and perhaps pity. It was a bitter truth. "I will be as quick as I can," she promised. "We need salt, and ammunition for the Winchester, and a needle, if they have one." He nodded, his gaze lingering on the fort. Do not speak to soldiers if you can avoid it. They ask too many questions. He handed her a few coins. Worn smooth with use. This should be enough. Leading the bay mare, Eliza walked down the dusty main street. She felt 100 pairs of eyes on her. Her dress was torn and stained. Her face was burned by the sun, and her hair was a wild tangle under her bonnet. She was a piece of the wilderness that had wandered into their orderly, fragile world, and they stared at her as such. Men sitting on porch railings fell silent. Women sweeping their doorsteps paused to watch her pass. She kept her eyes fixed straight ahead, focusing on the faded sign that read General Mercantile. The store was a dim, cool cavern smelling of coffee beans, leather, and smoked bacon. A thin, balding man with a perpetually worried expression stood behind a long wooden counter. He watched her approach, his eyes taking in her disheveled state. "Help you?" Mammy asked, his tone wary. "I need salt," she said, her voice sounding loud in the quiet store. "A pound, and a needle and thread, and cartridges for a Winchester rifle." The storekeeper's eyebrows rose slightly at the mention of ammunition, but he turned without a word and began to gather her items. He placed them on the counter, his movements precise and economical. As Eliza counted out Taza's coins, the bell above the door jingled, and 2 men stepped inside. They were soldiers, their blue uniforms a stark, clean contrast to the dusty surroundings. The one in the lead, an officer, was tall and immaculately dressed, his boots polished to a high shine and his blonde hair carefully combed. He moved with an easy, confident authority. He paused just inside the door, his eyes adjusting to the dim light. His gaze swept the room and then settled on Eliza. A slow smile spread across his handsome face, a smile that did not reach his cold, pale blue eyes. "Mrs. Hart," he said, his voice smooth and cultured. "Eliza Hart. It is you, isn't it?" Eliza froze, her hand hovering over the coins. The sound of her name was a physical shock. How could he possibly know who she was? She looked up, and a wave of nausea washed over her as she recognized him. It was Captain Edmund Pike, Jonah's superior officer, the man who had been so charming, so solicitous at the fort, and whose smile had always felt like a mask. "Captain Pike," she managed to say, her throat suddenly tight. "I was so terribly sorry to hear of your husband's passing," he said, stepping forward. He took her hand, his grip cool and firm. A tragedy, a great loss to the service. Jonah was a fine man. His eyes held a look of practiced sympathy, but underneath it, she saw a flicker of something else, a keen, calculating intelligence. "When your wagon train arrived without you, I confess I feared the worst. Silas here." He gestured to a lean, hard-faced man who had entered behind him. "Has been searching for any sign of you." Eliza's blood ran cold. Silas, it was the name she had heard in the canyon. The man with the cold, flat voice. This was the hunter. He stood by the door, his face impassive, his eyes like chips of stone. He was watching her, but he was also watching the street, his attention divided. "I have been delayed," Eliza said, her mind racing. She had to be careful. "Clearly," Pike said, his smile unwavering. "The territory is no place for a woman alone. Mrs. Hart, you are in considerable danger. There are hostiles everywhere." He glanced meaningfully toward the street. "You must allow me to offer you the protection of the fort. You will be my guest until we can arrange for a proper escort to take you east." It was not an offer. It was a command wrapped in the language of chivalry. To refuse would be to admit she had other plans, a protector of her own. It would be an admission of guilt, though she was not yet sure of the crime. "That is very kind of you, Captain," she said, forcing a small, grateful smile. "I would appreciate that very much." "Excellent," Pike said, his own smile widening. "I will have a room prepared for you at the hotel for the night. We can ride up to the fort in the morning. A good meal and a soft bed will do you a world of good." He placed a hand lightly on her arm, a gesture of proprietary concern. "You must be exhausted." He paid the storekeeper for her supplies, dismissing her attempts to use her own coins with a wave of his hand. He was taking control of the situation, of her. As they stepped out into the blinding sunlight, he gave her arm a gentle squeeze. "You rest now, Mrs. Hart. We have much to discuss in the morning, about Jonah's final days and his effects." He guided her toward the hotel, a 2-story building that looked marginally less weathered than the others. As they walked, Eliza saw him subtly nod to Silas Crowley, who had remained behind. The bounty hunter met the captain's gaze, and then, with a casual, deliberate motion, he detached himself from the storefront and began to stroll toward the edge of town, in the direction she and Taza had come from. The order had been given. The trap was being set. The hotel room was small and stifling, the air thick with the smell of stale dust and old linen. There was a lumpy bed, a washstand with a chipped porcelain bowl, and a single window that looked out onto the main street. Eliza stood at the window, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She watched Silas Crowley disappear around a corner, and a cold dread settled deep in her bones. He was hunting Taza. Pike had known her name. He had been looking for her, and he was interested in Jonah's effects. Her hand went to the canvas bag that held the leather-bound journal. It was no longer just a memento. It was evidence. Jonah had worked for Pike. He had handled supplies, signed manifests. The hunters in the canyon had said Pike wanted the book. Now she understood why. Pike was not trying to protect her. He was trying to silence her. She felt like a bird in a cage. The civilization she had craved had turned into a prison. She paced the small room, her mind a whirlwind of fear and confusion. She had to warn Taza, but how she was being watched. The entire town was Pike's domain. As evening fell, the town grew louder. The piano music from the saloon became more boisterous, punctuated by shouts and coarse laughter. Hunger gnawed at her, a dull ache that she had almost forgotten. She knew she had to go downstairs. To stay locked in her room would be suspicious. She had to act the part of the grateful widow, the damsel in distress, until she could find a way out. The hotel's small dining room was nearly empty, but it adjoined the saloon, and the noise and the smell of whiskey were overpowering. She took a small table in the corner, her back to the wall, and ordered a bowl of stew from a tired-looking waitress. As she ate, 3 men stumbled in from the saloon, their faces flushed with drink, their movements clumsy and aggressive. They were cattle drivers. By the look of their dusty clothes and spurs, they saw her immediately. A woman alone was a rare and inviting spectacle. They took a table near hers, their voices deliberately loud, their jokes crude and aimed at her. Eliza kept her eyes on her stew, trying to pretend she could not hear them, hoping they would lose interest. But they did not. One of them, a big man with a thick neck and a mean-spirited grin, pushed his chair back and swaggered over to her table. He leaned over, his breath a foul wave of cheap whiskey and unbrushed teeth. "Evening, ma'am," he slurred. "A pretty little thing like you shouldn't be eating all alone." "I am fine, thank you," Eliza said, her voice trembling slightly. "Please leave me be." Her refusal only amused him. "Feisty," he said to his friends, who laughed loudly. He reached out and put a grimy hand on her arm. "No need to be shy. We're just being friendly." "Take your hand off me," she said, her voice rising with a mix of fear and anger. At that moment, a figure appeared in the doorway that connected the dining room to the lobby. It was Taza. He did not look angry. He did not look threatening. He simply stood there, his presence filling the room with a silent, potent energy. The noise from the saloon seemed to fade. The air grew still and heavy. He did not look at the cowboy who was holding her arm. His dark eyes were fixed on Eliza. "It is time to leave," he said, his voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the room. The big cowboy let go of her arm and turned, his face contorting in a drunken sneer. "And who in the hell are you?" he demanded, puffing out his chest. Taza did not answer him. He simply waited, his stillness more unnerving than any threat. The cowboy, emboldened by the whiskey and the audience of his friends, took a step toward him. "I'm talking to you, you red devil." He shoved Taza hard in the chest. The move was a mistake. Taza did not resist the push. He used the man's own forward momentum, stepping aside with a fluid grace and placing a hand on the man's back. It was not a push, but a firm, irresistible guide. The cowboy, suddenly off balance, stumbled forward, his arms windmilling, and crashed heavily into an empty table, which overturned with a loud clatter of wood and cutlery. He lay there for a moment, dazed and humiliated, the fight knocked out of him not by a blow, but by a quiet, effortless redirection of his own aggression. His two friends, who had started to rise from their chairs, froze. They looked at Taza, who had not moved from his spot, and they saw not a man to be trifled with, but a force of nature. The hotel clerk peeked out from behind his desk, his eyes wide. The tired waitress stood with a plate in her hand, her mouth agape. They had all seen what happened. They had seen a drunk bully make a fool of himself, and they had seen an Apache warrior handle the situation with a calm and deadly competence, without throwing a single punch. Taza gestured for Eliza to come. She rose on shaky legs, leaving coins for the stew on the table, and walked to him. He put a hand on her back and guided her quickly out of the hotel and into the darkness of a side alley. "Pike has set a trap," he said, his voice urgent. "I saw his man, Crowley, searching the bluffs where we were. We cannot wait for morning." "How do we get out?" she whispered, her heart still hammering. "They will be watching the road." "There are other ways than the road," he said. He had the horses, hidden in the shadows behind the blacksmith's shop. He had spent the day observing, learning the town's rhythms, its blind spots. He helped her onto the mare, then swung up onto his own horse. They moved silently through the back alleys, their horses' hooves muffled by the soft dirt. As they reached the northern edge of town, a sound began to ring out, deep and resonant. Dong, dong, dong. It was the church bell, calling the faithful to evening prayer. The sound was loud, a steady, rhythmic clang that rolled across the town and out into the surrounding hills. Taza urged his horse into a trot, and Eliza followed. The sound of the bell was a perfect cover, swallowing the clatter of their hooves on the hard-packed earth as they broke from the last of the buildings and spurred the horses into a gallop. Eliza looked back one last time at the scattered lights of the town. It was not a sanctuary, it was a lie, a place where men like Pike wore the uniform of law and order to hide their corruption, and where the symbol of faith, the church bell, could be used to cover an escape. She felt a profound and final shift inside her. She was no longer a victim, a widow being carried along by events. She was a participant. Jonah had died because of a secret, and now that secret belonged to her. To live, she had to do more than just survive. She had to fight. She turned her face forward, toward the dark, open country and the man riding silently beside her, and did not look back again. They rode hard through the night, the sound of the church bell fading behind them like a dream. Taza did not follow a road, but a path of his own making, guided by the stars and the shape of the land. He led them into the foothills, a rumpled blanket of earth and rock that gradually rose toward the dark. Jagged peaks of the mountains. The air grew thinner, cooler. The horses, sensing the change in terrain, picked their way more carefully, their hooves striking sparks from hidden stones. By morning, they were deep into the pass, following the crude trail marked on the map Mateo Dominguez had given them. It was a treacherous path, winding along the edges of steep ravines and through thickets of twisted, ancient juniper trees. The world was a vertical one, all sharp angles and dizzying drops. Above them, the sky was a deep, unforgiving blue, and in it, dark shapes circled on the thermal updrafts. Vultures, They soared with an easy, patient grace, waiting for something below to die. The sight sent a shiver down Eliza's spine. This was a place where life was a temporary condition. Taza seemed to grow more alive in this harsh environment. He was no longer just a guide, he was a part of the landscape. His eyes missed nothing the displaced pebble that signaled a recent rockfall, the claw marks of a cougar on the bark of a pine, the way the wind whispered through a narrow gap in the rocks. He rode with a relaxed alertness, his body in constant communication with his horse and with the world around him. They had stopped to rest the horses in a small, sheltered basin when the first sign of trouble came. Taza, who had been scanning the high ridges above them, suddenly went still. He held up a hand for silence. Eliza followed his gaze, but saw nothing but sun-drenched rock and stunted trees. "What is it?" she whispered. "Sun on metal," he said, his voice a low growl. "High, on the south ridge." Before she could process his words, a puff of white smoke blossomed on the distant ridge, followed a second later by a sharp crack that echoed through the pass. A geyser of rock dust erupted from a boulder not 3 feet from where she stood. The sound of the bullet striking the stone was a vicious, angry hornet's buzz. "Crowley," Taza said, "the name a curse." He was already in motion, swinging into his saddle and pulling the mare's reins. "Ride, do not stop." There was no time for fear, only for a cold, sharp adrenaline that flooded her veins. She scrambled onto her horse, her heart hammering against her ribs. Taza spurred his paint forward, not back the way they had come, but deeper into the pass, into a maze of narrow, winding canyons. The chase was a nightmare of thundering hooves and screaming wind. Crowley was a relentless hunter. Another shot rang out, and a chip of rock flew from the canyon wall near Eliza's head. She ducked low over the mare's neck, her face buried in its coarse mane, trusting the animal's instincts and the man who was leading them. Taza was not just fleeing, he was thinking, using the terrain as his ally. He led them through a passage so narrow their stirrups scraped against the rock walls. He galloped across a treacherous slide of loose shale, knowing their lighter horses could manage it while a heavier pursuer might stumble. He was weaving a complex, unpredictable trail, trying to break Crowley's line of sight, trying to find a place where they could turn the tables. The pass opened up into a wide, rocky amphitheater, a dead end surrounded on 3 sides by sheer cliffs. For a terrifying moment, Eliza thought he had made a mistake, that he had led them into a trap. But Taza did not slow down. He galloped toward the far wall, then abruptly turned, guiding his horse into a nearly invisible fissure in the rock, a dark slash that led into another, smaller canyon. They were safe for the moment, their horses heaving for breath, their sides slick with sweat. Taza dismounted, his face grim. He pulled his Winchester from its scabbard. "He will follow," Taza said. "He knows this land. 2, he will come through that passage." He looked up at the rim of the canyon, and he will have the high ground. It happened just as he predicted. A few minutes later, Crowley appeared on the ridge directly above the narrow entrance they had just come through. He was a small, dark figure against the sky, but the rifle in his hands was unmistakable. He had them pinned. Taza pushed Eliza behind a cluster of massive boulders. "Stay here," he commanded. "Do not move." A shot cracked the air, and a bullet ricocheted off the rock above her head with a terrifying whine. Taza, crouched behind another rock a few yards away, raised his own rifle. He was a patient man who disliked killing, but she could see the cold resolve in his eyes. He would not let this man harm her. He waited, watching the ridge. Crowley fired again, the shot chipping a piece from Taza's cover. The bounty hunter was trying to draw his fire to make him reveal his exact position. Taza did not fall for the trick. He remained still, a predator waiting for the right moment. Eliza huddled behind the boulder, feeling utterly helpless. She was the reason they were in this situation. She was the baggage, the burden. Taza was risking his life to protect her and the secret she carried. A wave of shame washed over her, so hot and fierce it burned away her fear. She thought of his quiet competence, his kindness, the way he had mended her saddle and tended to her blistered foot. She would not be the reason he died. Her eyes darted around their small patch of ground. There were no other escape routes. She had no weapon, except for the heavy Winchester she had practiced with, and she knew she was no match for a marksman like Crowley. Her gaze fell on her satchel, which had been slung over her shoulder. Inside were her meager possessions, her sewing kit, a small block of soap, and the bag of ground black pepper she had bought at the mercantile. An idea, desperate and wild, sparked in her mind. It was a fool's plan, a woman's weapon against a man's rifle, but it was better than doing nothing. It was better than cowering behind a rock while the man who had saved her life fought for it. Another shot rang out, this one closer. Taza flinched as stone fragments sprayed his face. Crowley had found his range. The next shot might not miss. Eliza made her decision, keeping low. She crawled on her hands and knees from the relative safety of her boulder to the one Taza was using for cover. He glanced at her, his eyes flashing with a silent question. "I have an idea," she whispered, her voice tight. "Keep him busy." He seemed to understand. He nodded once, a quick, sharp movement. He raised his rifle, aimed carefully at the ridge well to the right of Crowley's position, and fired. The shot was a warning, a deliberate miss designed to draw attention. As Crowley instinctively turned toward the sound, Taza fired again, this time to the left. He was playing a dangerous game, bracketing his enemy, forcing him to keep his head down. It was the opening she needed. While the shots echoed through the canyon, Eliza scrambled up the steep, rocky slope that formed the side wall of the amphitheater. It was a grueling climb, her fingers raw, her lungs burning in the thin air. She did not dare to look down. She focused only on the next handhold, the next foothold, pulling herself upward with a strength born of pure desperation. She reached a narrow ledge that ran along the cliff face, about level with the ridge where Crowley was positioned. He was still focused on Taza below, reloading his rifle, waiting for his target to show himself again. He had not seen her. She pulled the small cloth bag of pepper from her satchel. Her heart was a wild drum in her chest. She had one chance. She took a deep breath, stood up on the narrow ledge, and with all her might, she threw the bag. It sailed through the air in a small, clumsy arc. For a heart-stopping moment, she thought it would fall short, but a gust of wind caught it, lifting it just enough. The bag landed on the rocks a few feet in front of Crowley and burst, sending up a fine, black cloud. The effect was instantaneous and dramatic. Crowley let out a choked gasp. Dropping his rifle, he clawed at his eyes, a stream of curses tearing from his throat. He stumbled backward, coughing and sputtering violently, temporarily blinded and incapacitated. "Now, Taza!" Now she screamed. Taza did not need to be told. He was already moving, sprinting across the open ground and disappearing into the narrow fissure. Eliza scrambled back down the slope, sliding the last few feet in a shower of dirt and gravel. Taza was there, grabbing her hand and pulling her after him. They ran, not looking back, the sound of Crowley's enraged, half-choked shouts fading behind them. They found refuge in a shallow cave hidden behind a curtain of stringy vines, its entrance barely visible from the trail. It was cool and dark inside, the silence a welcome relief after the chaos and noise of the chase. They collapsed on the sandy floor, their bodies trembling with exhaustion and the aftermath of adrenaline. For a long time, they said nothing. Taza cleaned his rifle, his movements calm and methodical, a comforting rhythm in the quiet darkness. Eliza watched him, her breathing slowly returning to normal. She had faced a man with a gun, and she had not run. She had acted. She had made a difference. A new and unfamiliar feeling began to take root inside her, a sense of her own strength. When her hands had stopped shaking, she reached for Jonah's canvas bag. She needed to know. She needed to understand what was worth all this death and danger. She pulled out the leather-bound journal. She opened it, her fingers tracing Jonah's familiar, elegant script. At first, the entries were mundane notes on weather, descriptions of the landscape, complaints about the food at the fort. But then, the tone began to change. The entries grew shorter, more secretive. There were lists of names and numbers, records of shipments. And then she found it, a series of entries that laid the truth bare, written in a cramped, hurried hand that spoke of fear and guilt. Jonah had not been just a clerk. He had been a key part of Captain Pike's scheme. Pike was stealing from the army, diverting supplies meant for the soldiers and for the Apache bands who were supposed to be receiving government rations under treaty agreements. He was selling them to unscrupulous miners and settlers for a huge profit. Jonah's job had been to falsify the manifests, to sign for goods that were never delivered, for food that was never distributed. He had signed for ghosts. Eliza felt a cold sickness spread through her. The husband she had loved and mourned, the good, gentle man she thought she knew, had been a thief. He had been complicit in a crime that was not just about money, but about lives. The sickness that had killed Sansi, Taza's wife, had been made worse by hunger, by the broken promises of men like Pike and Jonah. Tears streamed down her face, hot and silent. They were tears of grief, not just for the husband she had lost, but for the man she had never truly known. But as she read on, the story took one last, heartbreaking turn. The final entries were filled with a desperate, mounting remorse. Jonah had wanted to stop. He had confronted Pike, had threatened to expose him. Pike had laughed at him, had threatened him in turn. The very last entry was short, almost illegible. "He will kill me if I stay. But I cannot run. I must get this book to Eliza. She is good. She will know what to do. I will meet the wagon train at Apache Pass. I will make this right." He had never made it. The fever had taken him first. But he had died trying. He had died trying to undo the wrong he had done, to get this book, this proof, into her hands. Her sorrow did not vanish, but it was transformed. The weight of it settled, hardened, and became something else. It became a cold, hard stone of purpose. She finally understood. Jonah had not left her a legacy of shame. He had left her a responsibility. This journal was not a memento of a painful past she needed to escape. It was a weapon. It was a tool for the future, her future and Taza's. She closed the book. The sound was a quiet, final click in the stillness of the cave. She looked across the small, dark space at Taza, who had stopped his work and was watching her. His dark eyes filled with a quiet understanding. He had seen the tears, and he had seen the change that came after them. The bond between them, forged in the desert by a simple bargain of safety for fire, had been tempered by shared kindness on a dusty road. Now, in this dark cave, after a trial of blood and rock and fear, it was being hammered into something new, something stronger. It was an alliance. She was no longer a survivor being protected. She was a partner in his fight, and it was her fight, too. They left the cave at dusk, traveling through a landscape that was steadily climbing, leaving the heat of the desert floor behind. The air grew sharp with the scent of pine and the clean, cold smell of high places. Taza pushed them onward, his urgency a silent current that pulled Eliza along. He knew Crowley was not a man to give up easily. He would be nursing his rage and his stinging eyes, but he would come after them. Their only advantage was the map, the miner's trail that was their one hope of staying ahead. The weather turned on the second day. The sky, which had been a vast and cloudless expanse of blue, began to curdle, turning a flat, metallic gray. The wind, which had been a warm breath from the south, shifted and began to blow from the north with a sharp, biting edge. Taza stopped frequently, his head tilted, sniffing the air like an animal. "A storm is coming," he said, his voice low and serious. "A bad one." Eliza, who had grown up with the predictable seasons of the East, looked at the sky in confusion. "But it is autumn," she said. "Not the time for snow." "The mountains do not care for the calendar," he replied grimly. "They make their own seasons." His words proved prophetic. Within the hour, the first flakes began to fall. They were not the light, delicate crystals of a gentle snow, but fat, wet flakes that clung to their clothes and melted on the horses' warm hides. The temperature plummeted. The wind rose to a mournful howl, driving the snow horizontally, a blinding white curtain that erased the world. The trail, which had been difficult to follow in clear weather, disappeared completely. The horses whinnied in protest, their steps becoming hesitant and unsure. Eliza pulled her thin shawl tighter, but the wet cold soaked through to her skin, chilling her to the bone. She could not see more than a few feet in front of her. She could only follow the broad, dark shape of Taza's back, a lone anchor in a swirling white chaos. They were in serious trouble, and she knew it. To be caught in the open in a blizzard like this was a death sentence. They would become lost, wander in circles until exhaustion and the cold claimed them. Fear, a familiar companion, began to wrap its icy fingers around her heart. Just when a numb despair began to set in, Taza reined in his horse. He was pointing, his arm a rigid line in the storm. Eliza strained her eyes, peering through the maelstrom of snow. At first, she saw nothing but the ghostly shapes of pine trees, their branches heavy with white. Then she saw it a darker square against the gray rock face, a faint, almost invisible hint of a straight line in a world of wild, natural curves. It was a roof. It was a small, dilapidated cabin, tucked into a grove of trees on a protected slope of the mountain. It had clearly been abandoned for years. The log walls were silver with age, and a section of the roof over the small porch had caved in under the weight of past snows. But the main structure seemed intact. It was a shelter. It was salvation. They stumbled toward it, leading the exhausted horses. The small stable attached to the side of the cabin was in even worse shape than the house, but it would keep the worst of the wind off the animals. After they had unsaddled them and given them the last of their grain, they turned their attention to the cabin itself. The door hung from a single leather hinge, but it opened with a groan of protest. The inside was a single small room, filled with the cold, damp smell of old wood smoke and disuse. A thick layer of dust and mouse droppings covered the rough plank floor. There was a stone fireplace against one wall, a crude, handmade table, and 2 rickety chairs. A rope bed frame with a tattered, straw-filled mattress was shoved into a corner. It was not much, but to Eliza, it felt like a palace. It had 4 solid walls and a roof that, for the most part, was still there. While Taza used a piece of broken shingle to scrape the worst of the debris from the hearth, Eliza found a stiff pine bough and began to sweep the floor, sending up clouds of dust. They worked in a focused, efficient silence, their actions born of a shared, desperate need. They were a team, a small pocket of order and purpose in the face of the storm's chaos. Taza found a leak in the roof where a few logs had rotted, allowing a steady drip of melting snow to fall near the hearth. He climbed onto the table and, using his knife, wedged pieces of bark and pine needles into the gap. It was a temporary fix, but it worked. The dripping stopped. Outside, the storm raged with a new fury. The wind shrieked around the corners of the cabin, and the snow fell so thick it was like a solid white wall outside the single grimy window pane. But inside, a small miracle was happening. Taza, using the flint and steel from his pouch and a piece of dry inner bark he had been saving, coaxed a tiny spark into a flame. He fed it slivers of wood, and soon, a small, cheerful fire was crackling in the hearth. The fire was the heart of their small, temporary world. It pushed back the crushing cold and the encroaching darkness. It filled the small room with a warm, golden light and the comforting smell of burning pine. The change was so profound it was almost magical. The derelict cabin was transformed into a sanctuary, a home. Taza had snared 2 more rabbits on their journey, and Eliza set about skinning and cleaning them with a practiced skill that would have shocked the woman she used to be. She put them in their small pot with some water and the last of her salt and set it on the stones by the fire to stew. They sat on the floor, leaning against the hearth, sharing the single threadbare blanket they found on the bed frame. The warmth of the fire slowly seeped into their bones, chasing away the deep, persistent chill. They ate the stew directly from the pot, passing it back and forth, the hot, savory broth a balm to their weary bodies and souls. They did not speak. There was no need. The silence was not empty or awkward. It was full of the unspoken things they had been through together. The fear, the chase, the shared moments of kindness and trust, huddled together in the tiny cabin, with the blizzard howling outside. A new and powerful intimacy began to bloom between them. It was not born of romance or flirtation, but forged in the crucible of survival. They had faced death together, and in doing so, had found a profound connection to life and to each other. Eliza was acutely aware of him beside her. She could feel the solid warmth of his shoulder pressed against hers. She could smell the scent of pine smoke and cold air that clung to his buckskin tunic. She could hear the slow, steady rhythm of his breathing, a calm and reassuring sound against the wild fury of the storm. In all her life, she had never felt so completely safe. "Are you afraid?" she asked, her voice a soft murmur that was almost lost in the sound of the wind. He was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the dancing flames. "Not of the storm," he said finally. His answer was simple, but it held a world of meaning. The storm was just weather. It was a clean, honest danger. The dangers posed by men like Pike and Crowley were something else entirely, something twisted and corrupt. She leaned her head against his shoulder, a gesture so natural and instinctive it surprised her. He did not stiffen or pull away. He simply allowed it, accepting the small act of trust. His stillness was a comfort, a rock she could lean on in this turbulent world. The fire burned low, casting long, flickering shadows on the rough log walls. The warmth, the food, and the profound exhaustion of the past few days began to weigh heavily on her. Her eyelids grew heavy. She was drifting in that warm, hazy space between wakefulness and sleep, a place of quiet contentment. When she felt him shift beside her, he looked down at her, his dark eyes soft in the firelight. He saw not the disheveled survivor, but the woman. She was strong, resilient, and possessed of a courage she was only just beginning to recognize in herself. He saw the faint smudges of soot on her cheek, and the way the firelight caught the stray strands of her hair, turning them to gold. He reached up and gently tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, his fingers brushing against her skin. The touch was light, but it sent a jolt of warmth through her entire body, waking her completely. She looked up at him, her heart suddenly beating a little faster. The air in the small cabin grew thick, charged with a new and unspoken emotion. He leaned closer, his voice a low, soft whisper, a sound meant only for her, a sound that was a part of the fire and the wind and the night. "This cabin's big enough for 2, especially if one is you," he whispered, then pulled her gently to the floor. He guided her down onto the blanket that was spread before the hearth, his movements slow and deliberate, giving her every chance to pull away. But she did not. She went with him willingly, her body trusting him in a way her mind was still trying to comprehend. They lay on their sides, facing each other, the firelight painting their faces in soft shades of orange and red. He looked at her for a long, silent moment, his eyes asking a question for which there were no words. She answered with a small, almost imperceptible nod. He leaned in and kissed her. It was not a kiss of passion or of desperate hunger. It was a kiss of discovery, of quiet affirmation. It was as gentle as the falling snow, as warm as the firelight. It tasted of wood smoke and the faint, lingering salt of their meal. His lips were soft, hesitant at first, and then, as she responded, they grew more confident. She felt the rough texture of his tunic under her hand, heard the soft whisper of his breath mingling with her own. In that single, simple touch, years of loneliness and fear seemed to melt away from her. The grief for Jonah, the terror of being abandoned, the constant, gnawing anxiety of the past few weeks, it all receded, replaced by a moment of profound and healing stillness. This man, who had been a terrifying stranger, then a guide, then a protector, had become something more. He was her partner. He was her sanctuary. When the kiss ended, they did not speak. He simply held her, his arm a solid, reassuring weight around her. She rested her head on his chest, listening to the steady, strong beat of his heart. Outside, the blizzard raged on, but inside the small, warm cabin, a new world had been born. The morning came, bright and cold and silent. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world transformed. A thick, pristine blanket of snow covered everything, sparkling and dazzling in the brilliant sunshine. It was a world of breathtaking beauty, but also a world where their trail was completely erased. For now, they were ghosts. They stood in the doorway of the cabin, looking out at the new world. The kiss of the night before hung in the air between them, unspoken but unforgotten. It had changed everything. Eliza was the one who broke the silence. She turned to him, her eyes clear and resolute. The fear was gone. The uncertainty was gone. In its place was a calm, steady purpose. "This is not just about escaping anymore, is it?" she said. "It is not just about me getting to safety." She touched the canvas bag at her hip, the bag that held Jonah's journal. "This is about justice. For Jonah, for what he did, and for what he tried to undo." She looked him in the eye, her gaze unwavering, and for Sansi, and for all the others who died because of the hunger, because of the lies. Taza looked at her, and for the first time, she saw him smile. It was not a big smile, just a small, slow curving of his lips, but it lit up his entire face. He had been fighting this fight alone for a long time, a lonely warrior seeking justice for a people whose voices were not heard. Now, he was not alone. He reached out and took her hand, his fingers lacing through hers. His hand was warm and strong. "Yes," he said, his voice firm. "It is. Our fight." They stood there for a long moment, hand in hand, looking out at the bright, silent, snow-covered world. They were no longer a man and a woman from two different worlds, bound by a temporary bargain. They were a family, forged in fire and ice, with a single, shared purpose. They had a promise to keep, and a reckoning to deliver. The blanket of snow that had given them cover was a temporary gift. It melted under the strengthening sun, turning the mountain passes into treacherous rivers of mud and slush. The descent was a slow, careful process, a reversal of their desperate climb. They left the clean, cold silence of the high peaks behind, returning to a world of dust and heat and men. The memory of the cabin, of the firelight and the quiet intimacy, was a warm coal Eliza carried inside her, a source of strength against the harsh reality that lay ahead. They traveled with a new purpose. It was no longer a flight, but a march. Jonah's journal was no longer a burden of grief, but a weapon she was learning how to wield. They spoke of it in the evenings, by their small, carefully concealed fires. Taza, listening to her read the damning entries, saw the lines of corruption connect, saw the pattern of lies that had led to the hunger and sickness that had stolen his wife. His own quest for honor was now bound inextricably to hers for justice. The railroad town of Redemption was different from the last. It was not a sleepy outpost, but a noisy, bustling artery of commerce. An engine sat hissing on a siding, a great iron beast smelling of coal smoke and hot metal. Men shouted, hammers rang, and the very air seemed to vibrate with the raw energy of a place that was going somewhere. A circuit judge was in town, and with him came the temporary, fragile promise of the law. They entered the town separately. Taza, leading the horses, went directly to the livery stable at the far end of the street, a silent, watchful shadow melting into the background. Eliza, her dress cleaned as best she could, her hair tied back neatly, walked down the main street, the canvas bag containing the journal held tightly in her hand. She was no longer the disheveled, terrified creature who had stumbled into the last town. There was a new steel in her spine, a new clarity in her eyes. She was not looking for shelter. She was looking for an ally. She found it on a small, freshly painted sign hanging outside a narrow, two-story building squeezed between a hotel and a land office. The black letters were simple: professional, A. Monroe, attorney at law. The initial gave her a flicker of hope. She climbed the external staircase and knocked on the door. A voice from within called out, "It is open!" The office was a single room, neat and surprisingly orderly. Bookshelves lined one wall, filled with thick, leather-bound volumes. A desk, clear of clutter except for a neat stack of papers and an inkwell, faced the door. And sitting behind that desk was a woman. She was perhaps a few years older than Eliza, with intelligent gray eyes, a firm jaw, and hair the color of sand pulled back in a severe but practical bun. She wore a simple, dark dress, unadorned with the ruffles and lace that were fashionable. She looked at Eliza not with the idle curiosity of a townswoman, but with the sharp, appraising gaze of someone who was paid to see the truth of things. "May I help you?" she asked, her voice as clear and direct as her gaze. "Are you Abigail Monroe?" Eliza asked, her own voice steady. "I am," the woman confirmed. "And you are—" "My name is Eliza Hart. I need to hire you." Abigail Monroe leaned back in her chair, steepling her fingers. "A legal matter. Mrs. Hart, or do you simply need a document witnessed?" "A legal matter," Eliza said. "A criminal matter. It concerns theft, fraud, and the United States Army. It concerns Captain Edmund Pike." At the mention of Pike's name, Abigail's expression sharpened. A flicker of something, perhaps recognition or distaste, crossed her features before being replaced by a mask of professional neutrality. "Those are very serious accusations," she said slowly. "Captain Pike is an important man in this territory. To make such a charge, you would need more than just a story. You would need incontrovertible proof." "I have it," Eliza said. She placed the canvas bag on the desk, and from it, she drew the leather-bound journal. She pushed it across the polished wood. "It is all in there. My late husband's records. He worked for Captain Pike." For the next hour, there was no sound in the small office but the rustle of pages and Eliza's quiet, steady voice. She told her story. From the wagon train to the canyon, from the ambush in the pass to the blizzard in the mountains. She did not speak of the kiss in the cabin, but she spoke of Taza, of his protection and his guidance, presenting him not as a savage captor, but as the honorable partner he was. Abigail listened without interruption, her gray eyes never leaving Eliza's face. When the story was finished, she sat in silence for a long time, her fingers resting on the cover of the journal. "This is a powerful document, Mrs. Hart," she said at last. "It is a confession from a man who is now dead. It details a systematic and monstrous crime, but a clever defense attorney. And Captain Pike will have the best, will say it is nothing but the bitter scribblings of a disgruntled employee." She tapped the book. "It is a start, but we need more. We need a living voice to confirm what this book says." "How do we find that?" Eliza asked, a knot of disappointment tightening in her stomach. Abigail stood up and walked to the window, looking down at the bustling street. "Men like Pike are arrogant. They believe their power makes them invisible. But they are also careless. Corruption on this scale requires accomplices. And accomplices talk." She turned back to Eliza. "The soldiers at the local garrison are supplied by Pike's quartermaster command. Their food is poor, their blankets are thin, and their pay is often late. Yet Captain Pike and his inner circle live very well. That breeds resentment, and resentment loosens tongues. especially when whiskey is involved. That evening, Taza sat in the corner of a noisy saloon near the fort, a place Abigail had called the Dusty Spur. He was just another quiet man nursing a beer, a figure so still he was easily overlooked. He listened to the boisterous talk of the soldiers, their complaints about their commanding officer, their crude jokes. And then he heard it. A young corporal, his face barely old enough to grow a proper beard, was drinking heavily, his voice thick with a mixture of alcohol and guilt. "It ain't right," the corporal said to his companion, his voice slurring. "We eat hardtack that could break a man's teeth, and he dines on canned oysters and French wine. I seen the manifests. I seen the crates. They come in marked medical supplies, or replacement saddles, and they go straight from the train to his private wagon." He slammed his mug on the table. "And the engine rations, half of it is sand and sawdust. It's a disgrace." The next day, Abigail Monroe found Corporal Samuel Jones nursing a spectacular headache and a guilty conscience. She did not threaten him. She did not bribe him. She simply sat with him in the back room of her office and laid out the facts as she knew them, her voice calm and logical. She showed him a specific entry in Jonah's journal, a date and a shipment number. "You signed for this shipment of blankets, Corporal," she said quietly. "But they never reached the barracks, did they? They were sold to the mining camp up on Silver Creek." The color drained from the young soldier's face. He looked at the journal, at Abigail's steady, unpitying eyes, and the dam of his fear and resentment finally broke. He talked for 2 hours, his words a torrent of names, dates, and destinations that confirmed every detail of Jonah's confession. He described the entire network, from the corrupt railroad agent who falsified the bills of lading to the merchants who fenced the stolen goods. When he was done, he looked like a man who had been bled of a terrible poison. Abigail now had her living voice. She had the proof. She sat at her desk, a new light in her eyes, a kind of fierce, intellectual excitement. "We have him, Mrs. Hart," she said, her voice ringing with conviction. "We will petition the circuit judge tomorrow morning. We will present the journal and a sworn affidavit from Corporal Jones. The judge will have no choice but to open a formal inquiry." Eliza felt a surge of hope so powerful it was dizzying. For the first time, she could see a path through the darkness, a way to the end of this long and terrible road. They were looking over the journal, with Abigail making notes on a legal pad, when the attack came. Eliza was standing near the window, looking out at the long shadows of the late afternoon. Taza, as always, was not in the room. He was across the street, a silent guardian sitting on a bench in front of the assayer's office, seemingly dozing in the sun, but she knew he was watching, always watching. She saw the glint first, a tiny, brilliant flash of light from the top of the tall wooden water tower that stood at the end of the street. It was just for an instant, a star that winked into existence and then vanished. It was the sun on metal. Before her mind could even form the words of warning, the window beside her head exploded inward in a shower of glass and splintered wood. A sound like a giant whip crack echoed through the room. Abigail cried out in shock and dove to the floor. A book on the shelf behind her desk, a thick volume of federal statutes, leaped into the air as if kicked. A neat, round hole punched clean through its leather binding. The bullet, meant for Abigail, was buried in the wall behind it. The attack had come from the water tower, Crowley. Across the street, Taza was already on his feet, his own rifle in his hands. He had seen the glint, too. His reaction was not one of thought, but of pure, honed instinct. He did not waste time trying to get a clear shot at a hidden sniper. He did not aim for the man. He aimed for the tower itself. He fired once. The bullet, instead of seeking flesh, struck one of the thick iron bands that held the massive wooden water tank together. The impact produced a loud, resonant clang, a deep, bell-like tone that vibrated through the entire structure. It was a sound that was both a warning and a physical shock. For a sniper who relied on stillness and a steady hand, The vibrating platform was an impossible challenge. A second shot from the tower went wild, burying itself harmlessly in the dirt of the street. A moment later, a small figure scrambled down the ladder on the far side of the tower and disappeared into the back alleys. Taza's single, strategic shot had not killed the assassin, but it had disarmed him, neutralized him, and saved Abigail's life. Chaos erupted in the street. People shouted and ran for cover. The town marshal and his deputy appeared, their pistols drawn, looking confused and uncertain. But the real response came not from the local law, but from the fort. Within minutes, a troop of 12 soldiers, led by Captain Pike himself, came riding down the main street at a canter, their horses kicking up clouds of dust. Pike was the very image of military authority, his face a mask of grim concern. But as he dismounted in front of Abigail's office, his cold blue eyes met Eliza's through the shattered window, and she saw the triumphant, reptilian gleam in them. He had lost the battle, but he was about to win the war. He did not speak to Abigail. He did not ask about the assassin. He strode to the bottom of the stairs, a rolled document in his hand, and addressed the small crowd that had gathered. "This town is now under military jurisdiction until the source of this insurrection is dealt with," he announced, his voice ringing with false authority. He unrolled the document. "I have here a warrant, signed by a federal magistrate, for the arrest of one Eliza Hart." A collective gasp went through the crowd. Abigail appeared at the top of the stairs, her face pale but her expression furious. "On what charge, Captain?" she demanded. Pike looked up at her, a cruel smirk playing on his lips. "On the charge of treason, madam, for colluding with a known hostile, for providing aid and comfort to an enemy of the United States government, and for conspiring to incite violence against the good people of this territory." He looked directly at Eliza, his voice dropping to a theatrical, sorrowful tone. "It is a sad duty to perform. We had hoped to save you, Mrs. Hart, but it seems you chose to side with the very savages who have been preying upon our people." 2 soldiers started up the stairs. The game had changed. The courtroom had been moved to the street. The law, which they had sought as a shield, was now being used as Pike's most powerful sword. Eliza was no longer the accuser. She was the accused. The courtroom was not a room at all. It was a cavernous railroad warehouse, a place that smelled of grain dust, creosote, and the metallic tang of the nearby tracks. Sunlight streamed in through the gaps in the board walls, cutting the dusty air into solid, golden shafts. Makeshift benches had been arranged for the townspeople, a gallery of curious and wary faces. At the far end, on a platform built of stacked shipping crates, sat the circuit judge, a man named Miller with a face like a worn leather boot and eyes that had seen too much to be easily impressed. Eliza sat on a hard wooden chair beside Abigail Monroe, a prisoner in all but name. 2 of Pike's soldiers stood behind her, their expressions blank, their rifles held loosely but ready. Captain Pike himself sat at a separate table, the picture of calm authority, a man in complete control of the proceedings. He had chosen the venue, he had provided the guards, and he had framed the narrative. This was not a trial, it was a piece of theater, and he was the director. Somewhere in the deep shadows at the back of the warehouse, Taza watched. Eliza could not see him, but she could feel his presence, a point of stillness in the shifting crowd, a silent promise that she was not alone. Judge Miller banged a gavel made from a wooden mallet. "This court is now in session," he said, his voice a gravelly rumble that cut through the murmurs of the crowd. "We are here to hear the charges brought by the United States Army against Mrs. Eliza Hart. Captain Pike, you may begin." Pike rose, his movement smooth and confident. He addressed the jury, 12 men chosen from the townspeople, shopkeepers, a blacksmith, ranchers, their faces a mixture of apprehension and grim frontier resolve. "Gentlemen," Pike began, his voice ringing with sincerity, "what we have here is not a crime, but a tragedy, a story of a good woman, grieving and lost, who fell under the influence of a dangerous and cunning savage. He painted a masterful picture, his words calculated to play on every fear and prejudice in the room. He described Eliza as a helpless widow, alone in the wilderness, discovered by Taza. He twisted the story, turning her rescue into an abduction. He spoke of Taza not as a man, but as a hostile, a renegade, a symbol of the terror that haunted the edges of their civilized world. "This woman does not deserve your condemnation," he said, his voice softening with false pity as he gestured toward Eliza. "She deserves our protection. She is a victim, manipulated by a savage mind, but her actions, however unwilling, have given aid and comfort to an enemy of this territory, and for that, the law must be served." He called his first witness, a grizzled prospector with shifty eyes and a stained beard. The man swore an oath on a Bible that looked as if it had never been opened, and proceeded to lie with a practiced ease. "I seen him up in the Dragoons," the prospector said, spitting a brown stream of tobacco juice into a nearby spittoon. "Seen the Apache dragging her along. She was fighting him, crying something fierce, looked terrified. She did." Abigail rose to cross-examine. She did not raise her voice. She did not attack. She simply began to ask quiet, precise questions. "What day was this, sir?" she asked. Tuesday. No, Wednesday," the man stammered. "And what was Mrs. Hart wearing? A dress? A gray one? Or maybe blue? It was dusty." "You say she was crying. From 100 yards away. Through the trees. You could tell she was crying." "I got sharp eyes," the man insisted, but a nervous sweat had begun to bead on his forehead. Abigail continued, her questions like a surgeon's scalpel, carefully dissecting his story, exposing the inconsistencies, the vague details, the impossible claims. By the time she was finished, the prospector was a sweating, blustering mess, and the jury was looking at him with open contempt. Pike's face had tightened, the first crack in his confident facade. "The defense calls its only witness," Abigail announced, "Mrs. Eliza Hart." All eyes turned to Eliza as she took the stand. Her heart was pounding, but her hands were steady. She looked at the faces of the jury, at the ordinary men who held her life in their hands. And she decided to trust them with the one thing she had left, the truth. She told her story, her voice clear and unwavering. She did not omit her initial fear of Taza. She described his quiet mercy, the water he had given her, the bargain they had made. She told them of the hunters in the canyon, of the ambush in the pass, of Silas Crowley's cold voice and colder eyes. Then Abigail placed the leather-bound journal on the rail in front of her. "Mrs. Hart, can you identify this book?" "It was my husband's journal," Eliza said. Pike was on his feet. "Objection, this is hearsay. The incoherent ramblings of a dead man, likely written while in the grip of the very fever that killed him. The jury can decide for itself what is incoherent." "Captain," Judge Miller said dryly. "Objection overruled. Proceed, Miss Monroe." Abigail opened the journal. "Mrs. Hart, would you please read the entry dated August the 12th? Eliza's voice did not waver as she read Jonah's words, the confession of a man trapped in a web of his own making. A murmur went through the crowd as she read the names, the dates, the details of the stolen goods blankets, sacks of flour, crates of repeating rifles. "It is a compelling story," Pike said with a sneer when she had finished. "A work of fiction, no doubt written by the hostile to save his own skin." "A work of fiction would not contain this," Abigail said. She produced a sheaf of papers. "These are the official supply manifests from Fort Defiance for the month of August, signed by Captain Pike himself. And this," she held up a smaller document, "is the sworn affidavit of Corporal Samuel Jones, attesting to the fact that these shipments never arrived." She laid the documents side by side on the judge's makeshift bench. She pointed to a signature on the official manifest. "This is the signature of Jonah Hart, according to the United States Army." Then she pointed to a page in the journal. "And this is the signature of Jonah Hart, according to his own hand." on a letter he was writing to his mother. Even from a distance, the difference was clear. The signature on the manifest was a careful, almost perfect imitation, but it lacked the natural flow. The confident loop of the G in Jonah's real signature, it was a forgery. My husband's final entries describe a system of forged documents and counterfeit supply seals used by Captain Pike to cover his crimes, Eliza said, her voice ringing through the silent warehouse. He describes the very seal used to approve these documents. The air was thick with tension. The jury was leaning forward, their faces grim. The townspeople were no longer just spectators. They were witnesses. The foundation of Pike's authority was crumbling, being washed away by a tide of simple, undeniable truth. Pike saw it. He saw the doubt in the jury's eyes, the anger on the judge's face. He saw his carefully constructed world collapsing. He turned his head slightly and his gaze fell on a dark shape lurking near a side entrance. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. The explosion of the gunshot was deafening in the enclosed space. It was not aimed at a person. The bullet struck the table in front of Abigail, splintering the wood and sending the journal flying into the air. The warehouse erupted into chaos. Women screamed. Men shouted and dove for cover behind sacks of grain. The jury scattered. In the ensuing panic, a figure darted from the side entrance. It was Silas Crowley. He lunged for the journal, which had landed in the dusty aisle. Another shot rang out, this one from one of Pike's own soldiers, a young, terrified boy who fired his rifle blindly into the rafters. Dust and splinters rained down. This was Pike's plan to create a panic, to steal the evidence in the confusion, to turn the law into a riot. But he had not counted on Taza. Taza moved from the back of the warehouse, not like a man, but like a force of nature. He was not there to fight. He was there to protect. He saw the blacksmith's wife and 2 small children cowering behind a flimsy crate. He threw himself in front of them, his body a shield, as a stray bullet slammed into the wall where they had been standing. He saw the young soldier, his eyes wide with panic, reloading to fire again. Taza moved with a blinding speed, grabbing the rifle barrel, pointing it toward the ceiling, and with a sharp twist, disarming the boy without hurting him. "Do not shoot your own people," he said, his voice a low, commanding growl. The soldier stared at him, his face a mask of shock and dawning comprehension. Crowley had the journal. He was sprinting for a large loading door at the back of the warehouse, a clear path to the alley and the horse he must have waiting. Pike was shouting orders to his men, but his soldiers were caught between their duty and the clear evidence of their own eyes. They were hesitant, confused. Eliza saw Crowley running. She saw the one piece of truth that could save them all about to disappear into the lawless back alleys of the town. And then she remembered. The map. The hand-drawn map Mateo Dominguez had given them. She had studied it, memorized its lines and paths. It showed the layout of the railroad yard, including the narrow passage that ran behind the warehouses, a shortcut from the main street to the alley Crowley was running for. She did not hesitate. She grabbed the arm of the blacksmith, a huge man with a soot on his face and bewildered rage in his eyes. "There is another way," she yelled over the din. "We can cut him off! Follow me!" She ran not toward the back, but out the main entrance, back into the bright, dusty street. The blacksmith followed, and seeing his example, a half-dozen other townsmen joined them, the livery owner, a young ranch hand, the storekeeper. They were a small, determined army, armed not with guns, but with a sudden, fierce sense of community justice. Eliza led them at a dead run, down the street and into the narrow passage between the land office and the hotel, just as the map had shown. It was a tight squeeze, a corridor of shadows and discarded refuse, but it opened up directly behind the warehouse. Silas Crowley burst through the loading door, the journal clutched in his hand, a triumphant sneer on his face. He expected an empty alley. He expected freedom. Instead, he ran straight into a wall of grim-faced citizens. The blacksmith stood in the center, a heavy hammer held in one massive fist. Crowley skidded to a halt, his eyes wide with shock. He looked back, but the dark, formidable shape of Taza had appeared in the doorway behind him. He was trapped. He raised his pistol, but he knew it was useless. The town had turned on him. The law he had despised had been replaced by something older, more powerful, the will of the people. Slowly, reluctantly, he lowered the gun and let it fall to the dirt. He looked at Eliza, his face a mask of bitter, resentful fury. "You should have just kept riding, lady," he spat. Then a strange, cruel smile touched his lips. "You know, that husband of yours. Pike told me he was running, trying to save his own skin. But that was a lie." He looked her straight in the eye. "He was not running from you. He was running to you. I was tracking him for 2 days before the fever got him. He was trying to get back to the wagon train. He was trying to give you that damn book himself." The word struck Eliza with the force of a physical blow. Jonah. He had not died a coward. He had not died a thief. He had died trying to be a hero. He had died trying to make it right, in that single ugly moment of Crowley's surrender. A great, painful weight lifted from her soul. Back in the warehouse, the dust was beginning to settle. The chaos had subsided, replaced by a stunned, heavy silence. Pike stood alone, his authority in tatters, his men looking at him with suspicion and contempt. The town marshal, a man Pike had dismissed as a useless bumpkin, walked up to him and calmly took his sidearm. Judge Miller stood on his platform of crates, his face like carved granite. He looked at the jury, who had reassembled, their faces set and hard. "Gentlemen," the judge said, his voice carrying through the silent warehouse, "do you have a verdict?" The blacksmith, acting as the jury foreman, stepped forward. He did not need to consult with the others. He looked not at the judge, but directly at Captain Pike. "We find that this officer of the United to be a disgrace to his uniform," he said, his voice a low, angry rumble. "We believe he should stand trial for his crimes. Not here. In a proper military court. Captain Edmund Pike, the man who had held the power of life and death in this territory, was placed under arrest. He did not resist. He had been defeated not by a bullet, but by a dead man's words and the courage of the people he had so profoundly underestimated. The red dust of the warehouse floor, the dust of this hard land, seemed to have finally settled on the side of justice. The silence that followed the verdict was more profound than the gunshot that had preceded it. It was a thick, heavy quiet, the sound of a community holding its collective breath, absorbing the shock of what had just transpired. Captain Edmund Pike stood frozen, the mask of authority stripped away, revealing the pale, pinched face of a common thief. His soldiers, who moments before had been his instruments of power, now looked at him with the dawning, contemptuous pity reserved for a fallen idol. The blacksmith, his role as jury foreman concluded, stepped forward and took the rifle from the young, trembling soldier Taza had disarmed. He did not look at Taza, but the gesture was one of clear, unspoken acknowledgement. The town marshal, emboldened by the shift in power, cleared his throat and officially placed Captain Pike in the town's small, sturdy jail, to be held for the military authorities who would be summoned by telegraph. Pike was led away, a small, diminished figure, and with his departure, it felt as though the entire territory took its first clean breath in a very long time. In the days that followed, the town of Redemption began to heal. The first step was Silas Crowley, faced with the choice between a hangman's noose for attempted murder and a prison sentence for his lesser crimes. The pragmatic bounty hunter chose to talk. He sat in Abigail Monroe's office, a cup of coffee steaming in his manacled hands, and laid out the entire rotten enterprise. His confession, signed and witnessed, was a detailed map of Pike's corruption, naming every co-conspirator, every illegal transaction. It was the final nail in Pike's coffin. The second step was taken by the townspeople themselves, led by the blacksmith and the storekeeper. They held a meeting in the very warehouse where the trial had taken place. It was not a place of judgment now, but of reconciliation. Men and women stood up and spoke of the poor quality of goods, of the suspicious shortages, of the way Pike's network of cronies had slowly been strangling the local economy. An idea took shape, a proposal that was passed by a unanimous show of hands. They established a community fund, a collection to be paid back to the families, both white and Apache, who had been cheated and starved by Pike's greed. It was a small gesture against a great wrong, but it was a start. It was an acknowledgement that justice was not just about punishing the guilty, but about lifting up the victimized. Eliza watched this transformation with a sense of quiet awe. She had come to this town a fugitive, expecting only danger and betrayal. Instead, she had found a community, a flawed, rough-hewn community, but one that, when faced with the unvarnished truth, had chosen to do the right thing. Abigail Monroe offered her a future. They sat in her office, the window now repaired with a new pane of glass that let the afternoon sun stream in. "The circuit judge is moving on," Abigail said, her tone practical as always. "But he is leaving me with the authority to act as a magistrate's clerk until a permanent replacement can be appointed. It is too much work for one person." She looked at Eliza, her intelligent gray eyes missing nothing. "You have a good hand, Mrs. Hart, and a clearer head than most men I know. The job is yours, if you want it. And the schoolhouse needs a teacher. The children here are growing up wild. They need to learn their letters." The offer was a lifeline, a chance to put down roots, to build a life from the ashes of her old one, a life of purpose, of service to the community that had, against all odds, embraced her. "I will think on it," Eliza said, her heart full. "Thank you, Abigail." That evening, as the sun began to dip below the distant mountains, painting the sky in soft shades of rose and gold, Taza came to her. He did not say much, as was his way. "Come," he said, "there is something we must do." He led her out of the town, away from the noise and the lights, to a small, quiet bluff that overlooked the valley. The air was still and warm, and the scent of sagebrush rose from the cooling earth. He had built a small fire, not for warmth, but for light and focus. He had with him Jonah's journal. He did not pray or chant. He simply stood before the fire, held the book in his hands for a long moment, and looked at Eliza. "This was his last fight," Taza said, his voice low and resonant. "He was not a warrior with a rifle, but he fought. He fought the bad man inside himself. He fought to bring the truth to you, in the eyes of my people. A man who dies in such a fight deserves honor." He opened the journal to the last, desperate entry Jonah had written. He carefully tore the page from the book. He folded it neatly and placed it in the heart of the fire. They watched together as the paper curled, blackened, and then bloomed into a bright, brief flame before collapsing into a whisper of white ash. The wind picked up the ash and scattered it into the twilight. "His words are free now," Taza said. "His fight is over." It was not a burial. It was a release. It was an act of profound respect, a recognition of the flawed, frightened, but ultimately courageous man her husband had been in his final days. Taza, the man whose wife had been a victim of the very crimes Jonah had enabled, was the one to grant him this final peace. Tears streamed down Eliza's face, but they were not tears of grief. They were tears of gratitude, of release, of a love for the man beside her so deep and powerful it felt as if her heart could not contain it. He had not asked her to forget her past. He had helped her to honor it, and in doing so, had freed her to embrace their future. They sat by the dying fire as the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky. The past had been settled. Now, they had to face what came next. "Abigail offered me a job," Eliza said softly, "as her clerk and as the school teacher." Taza was silent for a long time, looking out at the scattered lights of the town below. "It is a good place," he said. "The people here, they have learned to see." "But what about us?" she asked, the question she had been afraid to voice. "What kind of life can we have here?" I am a white woman. You are an Apache man. What of our children? They will belong to neither world. They will be caught in the middle, judged by both sides. The fear was real, a cold knot in her stomach. The town had accepted them in a moment of crisis, had celebrated them as heroes. But the day-to-day reality, the quiet, persistent grind of prejudice, was a different kind of enemy, one you could not fight in a courtroom or a gunfight. Taza turned to her, his face serious in the starlight. He did not offer her easy promises or false reassurances. He offered her the truth. "It will be hard," he said. "Their world has rules that I do not understand. My world is vanishing. Our children will not be caught between two worlds. We will make a new one for them. Here." He took her hand, his palm rough and warm against hers. "We will not be a white woman and an Apache man. We will be a family, and a family is its own world. We will teach them to be strong, to be honest, and to be proud of all that they are. It is the only way." He reached into the small pouch at his belt and took something out. He pressed it into her palm. It was a handful of dried corn kernels, hard and smooth and full of a silent, sleeping promise. "My grandmother taught me that a home is not a place you find," he said. "It is a place you plant. We will plant these together." It was the most profound commitment he could make, a promise of a shared life, a shared future, of putting down roots in this hard, unforgiving, but beautiful land. They did not have to wait long for the first sign that he was right. The next afternoon, a small delegation approached them as they sat outside the livery. It was the blacksmith, the storekeeper, and the town marshal. The blacksmith, acting as spokesman, cleared his throat, looking slightly uncomfortable but determined. "The town council had a meeting," he said, twisting his hat in his big hands. We appreciate what you both did, and we've come to a decision." He pointed to a small, empty patch of land on the gentle slope at the edge of town, a place with a few sturdy oak trees and a view of the rising sun. "That land belongs to the township. It ain't much, but it's yours, if you want it. A gift." Eliza was too stunned to speak. "There is a condition." The blacksmith hurried on, a faint blush rising on his cheeks. "The Overland Mail Company is putting a new express line through here. They need good horses, strong horses, trained for the trail. We've seen you with your animals. Taza, no one handles a horse like you do. If you would agree to be the trainer for the mail line, well, it would be a great service to the town." It was not charity. It was an offer of employment, of partnership. They were not just giving him a piece of land. They were giving him a place in the community, a role that was based not on his race, but on his skill. They were not just tolerating him. They were asking for his help. They were inviting him in. Taza looked at the men, at their earnest, hopeful faces. He looked at the patch of land, a small square of dirt and possibility. And then he looked at Eliza, and she saw in his eyes the same quiet, steady love that had guided her through the darkest days of her life. He did not need to speak. His answer was there for her to see. Yes, this was the world they would build. This was the place they would plant their home. The first axe blow was a clean, sharp sound in the crisp morning air, a note of beginning. The patch of land the town had given them was not grand, but it was theirs. It sloped gently to the east, catching the first rays of the sun, and a small, clear stream whispered along its southern edge. Sturdy oak trees offered shade and a promise of permanence. Here, they would plant their home. They built the cabin themselves, Taza, with a knowledge that seemed as innate as breathing, selected the trees, felling them with a patient, powerful rhythm. He showed Eliza how to notch the logs, his hands guiding hers, the feel of the rough bark and the solid weight of the wood becoming a part of her. She learned the smell of fresh pine sawdust and the satisfying thud of a well-seated log. It was hard, muscle-aching work, but it was a joyful labor. With every wall that rose, they were not just building a shelter, they were building a new world, a world made for two. The townspeople, who had first offered the land, now offered their help. The blacksmith forged hinges for their door and shutters, his hammer ringing with a friendly rhythm. The storekeeper's wife brought them a basket with fresh bread, a crock of butter, and a jar of apple preserves. Her initial suspicion of Eliza now replaced by a quiet, neighborly respect. They were a curiosity, a strange and unprecedented pairing. But they were also a part of the town's own story of redemption. They were a living symbol of the community's choice to stand for truth over the comfortable lies of authority. The cabin grew, small and sturdy, its 2 rooms smelling of pine and clean earth. Beside it, Taza built a corral, its fence as strong and true as the man himself, and in the rich soil beside the stream. Eliza planted the corn kernels he had given her. She pushed each one into the dark earth with her thumb, a small act of faith, a prayer for a future she was only just beginning to believe was possible. Their lives settled into a new rhythm, one dictated not by fear and flight, but by the rising and setting of the sun and the needs of their small homestead. In the afternoons, the cabin transformed. Eliza would clear the main room, and a small, shifting group of children would arrive, their faces scrubbed, their feet bare. She became their teacher. She taught them their letters, drawing the shapes in the dirt with a stick. She taught them their numbers, using smooth river stones as counters. More than that, she taught them stories, tales of courage and kindness, of right and wrong. She saw in their wide, curious eyes the future of this small town, and she felt a profound sense of purpose in tending to it. Taza's world was the corral. The Overland Mail Company, true to the blacksmith's word, had given him the contract to train their horses. He worked with a quiet, almost mystical patience. He did not break the horses' spirits. He seemed to speak to them in a language of stillness and respect, gentling them, earning their trust until they would follow his slightest command. The rough, hardened men who drove the mail wagons would watch him, their initial skepticism slowly turning to a deep and grudging admiration. They did not understand how he did it, but they could not deny the results. The horses he trained were the fastest, the strongest, and the most reliable on the line. He was judged not by the color of his skin, but by the undeniable quality of his work. The prejudice did not vanish entirely. Of course, it lingered like a bad smell in the corners of their lives. There was the woman who would turn her back when Eliza entered the mercantile, the group of men in the saloon whose laughter would fall silent and turn to hostile stares when Taza walked past. There were whispers, looks of pity or scorn. Each one was a small paper cut on the heart. In the beginning, it had filled Eliza with a familiar, helpless anger, but Taza taught her another way. He met the stares with a calm, level gaze that neither challenged nor yielded. He answered the whispers with a quiet dignity that could not be breached. He was a mountain, and their small-minded hatred was a wind that could only blow against him. It could not move him. Eliza learned from him. She learned to carry her head high, to meet a cold look with a polite nod, to find her strength not in defiance, but in a serene and unshakable sense of her own worth, and the worth of the life she was building with the man she loved. One evening, they sat at the simple wooden table Taza had built, and by the light of a kerosene lamp, Eliza wrote a letter. She read it aloud to him as she wrote, her voice soft in the quiet of their home. Dear Abigail, it began. We hope this letter finds you well. We have heard that the military tribunal has found Captain Pike guilty on all charges. A verdict, we are told, was made much easier by your brilliant and tireless work. The town of Redemption owes you a debt it can never fully repay. We have begun to build our life here, on the land the town so generously gave us. Taza is training the mail horses, and I have opened a small school. There is peace here. Abigail, a hard-won peace that you helped secure. We think of you often, and we will never forget what you did for us, and for the cause of justice in this wild and beautiful land. Your friends, Eliza and Taza Hart. She sealed the letter, a sense of closure settling over her. They had closed a chapter, a dark and painful one, and were now free to write their own. That night, she took Jonah's journal from the bag where it had lain untouched since the trial. All the pages had been removed, used to help start their fires, their ink-stained words turning to warmth and light. All that remained was the empty leather cover, with its faded army insignia. It was no longer a weapon or a burden. It was a relic, a testament. She took a leather thong and tied it to a wooden peg Taza had driven into the wall above the fireplace. It hung there, a dark, silent reminder of the high cost of truth, and of the man whose final act of courage had made their new life possible. The seasons turned. Their first crop of corn grew tall and green, its tassels catching the summer breeze. Autumn arrived, painting the leaves of the oaks in brilliant shades of orange and gold. The nights grew colder, and they spent their evenings by the fire, the flames reflecting in their eyes, a comfortable silence woven between them like a warm blanket. One evening, after a simple meal of roasted chicken and cornbread, Eliza was trying to mend a tear in one of Taza's shirts. Her stitches were clumsy, and she pricked her finger for the third time, letting out a small cry of frustration. Taza, who had been watching her from his chair, a small, amused smile on his face, got up and knelt beside her. He took the shirt and the needle from her hands. "Allow me," he said, his voice a low, gentle rumble. His large, strong hands, which could gentle a wild horse or fell a tree, moved with a surprising delicacy and precision, his stitches far neater and stronger than hers. She watched him, her heart swelling with a love so deep and complete it was a physical ache in her chest. She looked around their small, warm home, at the fire crackling in the hearth, at the empty journal hanging on the wall, at the man kneeling before her, mending her clumsy work with a quiet, patient love. The sheer, impossible goodness of it all overwhelmed her. She laughed, a soft, happy sound. He looked up, a question in his dark eyes. "I was just thinking," she said, a smile playing on her lips, "of that first night, in the mountains, in the storm." He knew instantly what she meant. A slow smile spread across his own face, a smile that reached his eyes and made them sparkle in the firelight. He leaned forward, his face close to hers, his voice a low, teasing whisper that held all the warmth and love of the life they had built together. "This cabin's big enough for two," he murmured, his eyes full of laughter. "Especially if one is you." They did not kiss. They simply looked at each other, their shared laughter filling the small room, a sound of pure, uncomplicated joy. The words that had been spoken in a moment of desperate, fragile intimacy were now spoken again in a moment of absolute, unshakable peace. Later, they stood in the open doorway, looking out at the night. The fire crackled behind them, a warm and steady heartbeat at the center of their home. A cool autumn wind rustled the dry leaves of the cornstalks in the garden, a sound like a soft, contented sigh. Above them, the sky was a vast, dark ocean, littered with 1,000,000 brilliant stars. This was their world, a small island of light and warmth carved out of the wilderness by courage, by truth, and by a love that had refused to recognize the boundaries that were supposed to keep them apart. They had chosen their freedom, a freedom that was bound not by law or by convention, but by the quiet, daily, and joyful work of a shared responsibility. And under the wide, watchful eyes of the stars, it was more than enough. Thank you for listening to our story. Please comment with where you are listening from, so we can all connect and share our thoughts. And do not forget to subscribe to our channel Wild West Tales, like the video, and support us further by pressing the hype button so this story can be heard by more people.